Hello, I'm Rebecca Catalanello, a deputy editor here at PolitiFact. For the first time, thanks to support from people like you, United Facts of America is free to everyone. You can still support truth in politics with PolitiFact, though. Empower democracy by backing PolitiFact, the nation's largest political fact-checking organization. Your donation fuels our mission to hold politicians accountable for their statements. We investigate claims, ensuring accuracy and transparency in political discourse. Your contribution, big or small, directly impacts the integrity of public discourse. Stand with PolitiFact to safeguard the integrity of our democracy. Donate today and be a part of the solution. Visit PolitiFact, that's politifact.com/donate. We thank you. Now, to the reason we're here. I am delighted and honored to welcome to United Facts of America, Dr. Céline Gounder. Dr. Gounder is an epidemiologist and infectious disease specialist who throughout her career has prioritized communicating important stories about public health to broad audiences. She's currently KFF Health News Senior Fellow and Editor-at-Large for Public Health. She's the creator of two podcasts, American Diagnosis, a podcast about health and social justice, and Epidemic, a deeply reported series about infectious diseases and their impact on humans and their communities. I highly recommend you listen to these. She's a CBS News medical contributor and previously a CNN medical analyst and frequent guest on MSNBC and NBC. Dr. Gounder also served on the COVID-19 advisory board for the Biden-Harris transition team. And while it appears she has long had an interest in getting out factual information about diseases and public health, she had a personal and profound encounter with the harms of disinformation and misinformation last year when her husband and soccer journalist, Grant Wahl, died, and his death became exploited by anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorists. Dr. Gounder, thank you so much for joining us.
It's great to be here, Rebecca.
I'm so glad you're here. Let's jump in. You frequently say that you know, and you say it very, very certainly that misinformation has a profit motive. Can you talk about how that plays out in the world of vaccine misinformation?
Yeah, what we've often seen are the people who are purveying vaccine mis and disinformation will then pivot from these vaccines don't work or these vaccines are harmful to, but hey, I have something that will work for you or that will help educate you more. If you look at some of the folks who've been doing this, whether it's Joseph Mercola, who according to the New York Times is worth over $100 million, Alex Jones with InfoWars, and so on, they are all selling something at the end of the day. It might be back in the days before streaming, CDs, CD-ROMs, videos, et cetera, of educational programming or supposed documentaries about vaccines and their harms. They might have been selling tickets to conferences where like-minded people gather, and they also get more mis and disinformation. And they might have been selling products, which anything from some of what we saw during the pandemic, like hydroxychloroquine or ivermectin being misused, to other things that are just simply herbals or supplements or the like, saying that these are the things that will actually help you. So if you look at these folks, they have made a lot of money off of this strategy. It is quite lucrative.
You got your master's degree in epidemiology from Johns Hopkins 23 years ago. I'm curious, how active was the anti-vax movement then, and how aware were you then of its influence?
Andrew Wakefield's paper in The Lancet came out in 1998, and he was the one that claimed that there was a link between MMR vaccine and autism. So this is right around the time I was, literally at the time I was getting that master's degree in public health. And we certainly saw a huge impact of that then, and it continues until this day, even though that paper was discredited, that it was retracted, that it was found to be fraudulent and have really shady methodology. But that was the start of a new wave, you could say, of mis and disinformation about vaccines. there had always been this problem dating back to the very first vaccines, particularly with smallpox. And some of this is also related to how these vaccines were rolled out, how they were targeted at certain populations, in particular around the late 1800s, early 1900s, both in England and the United States. People who were lower income, who were more marginalized, perhaps racial minorities, were targeted for enforcement of these vaccines in a way that did lead to mistrust in the system and did lead to conspiracy theories about the vaccines. But certainly Andrew Wakefield's paper in the late 90s led to another wave. And of course, we've seen even more mis and disinformation about vaccines since the COVID pandemic.
Did you, how have you seen, it sounds like it really did sort of inform your vision of the work that you wanted to do because you were there kind of at that pivotal time. I'm curious, how have you seen that movement grow and change since that point? And how has it affected broader trends in vaccine hesitancy and resistance?
Well, around the same time, you also have the rise of the internet, social media, which really puts a lot more fuel to the fire, so to speak, where some of this mis and disinformation could travel more broadly, but also was paired with other kinds of mis and disinformation. So what we see today is that vaccine mis and disinformation is really part of a menu of issues, and people get drawn into this rabbit hole through different specific issues and then get served up a whole menu of them. So I do think that is unique. The reach that people have, the way in which they're also, because of technology, very efficiently able to monetize that mis and disinformation. That is certainly a change since the 90s.
You started your production company, Just Human Productions, in 2017. It seems it's before the pandemic, and you had the aim of telling stories about public health. Your podcast, American Epidemic, it's dealt with gun violence, issues of mental health among young people, and the opioid epidemic. So good. And in February 2000, before most Americans were in lockdown, you started a podcast dedicated to understanding the coronavirus then. Mm-hmm. Since then, you've reported on Navajo Nation response to COVID-19, and you've taken the podcast to India and Bangladesh to tell the story of smallpox and its eradication. What inspired you to tell these kinds of public health stories in this way?
A couple things. So this really goes back to the Ebola epidemic in West Africa in 2014, 2015. At that time, I was doing a lot of television, especially for CNN, but others as well, and was really frustrated by the quality of the public health reporting at the time. It was very navel gazing. Could we get Ebola from a bowling ball or a subway pole? And that was related to my friend Craig Spencer having been out and about in New York City before he knew that he was coming down sick with Ebola, having just returned from West Africa. And that was the focus, not here's why these countries, these health systems were vulnerable to this kind of problem, this explosion in Ebola. The reporting was not about the people who lived there on the ground. There was some, of the, hey, look at me kind of journalist on the ground, but not really explaining the politics, the culture, the history that led up to this point, and also not holding people accountable for what happened as the epidemic waned and was brought under control. And the fact that many countries, including our own, really pulled up stakes and stopped funding health system strengthening after that, which means that those vulnerabilities persist. And so I found that very frustrating that the quality of the public health reporting was really lacking. So there was that. And then also, frankly, the 2016 election, where I felt like I had this hybrid response between being a medical and public health professional, but also now having branched out into journalism. And a lot of journalists were asking themselves, how did we miss that Trump was so politically popular and that he was going to win this election. How did we miss that? And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that the media centers a lot of its reporting in media cities like New York City, where I live, and that there's this whole part of the country, many communities that we simply don't hear about in journalism. And so to me, it was really important to say, one, we need higher quality public health reporting, but two, what are some of the communities we're not hearing about that are very much part of the United States, part of our fabric, and that we need to be hearing more about?
I find it interesting that your most recent turn in your podcast has been towards revisiting the story of smallpox. It was eradicated in 1980. So why did you want to tell that story, and what relevance does it have for people in the COVID era?
Well, I think people are frankly burned out on COVID. And I saw the same thing with Ebola. People developed, quote, Ebola fatigue, and they just didn't want to hear about it anymore. And I think we're in a similar place with COVID. And yet there are some really important lessons we need to be learning that we still haven't learned, honestly. And so are there other ways to tell some of these stories, to communicate some of these lessons in a way that feels fresher, but also is less political? And I think one thing about going back in time and history, it doesn't have sort of that same emotional charge as talking about something like COVID right now. And I also think there's something different about going to a different culture, a different part of the world, and being able to see some of those lessons through that lens. And there are some very important lessons to be taken from smallpox eradication, just as there are from COVID, that could be used to strengthen public health today.
Like what?
Well, I think one is dreaming big, what I would call moral imagination. So very often we limit our options to what are the most obvious things in front of our faces. And in the US in particular, that tends to be biomedical solutions. So in terms of COVID, that would be tests, medications, and vaccines. And we don't really think beyond that. Now, if you think about how other infectious diseases were brought under control, like say cholera, for example, that was not done with tests and medications and vaccines. That was done by cleaning up water, by having appropriate sanitation, by having clean water. So we've forgotten some of the lessons of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which is frankly when we made the biggest improvements in public health. And so much of that was really about how do you make communities healthier and safer, as opposed to resorting to more biotechnical solutions, which are more expensive, which rely on individuals to believe in them and take action. And so therefore will never have the same reach as some of these more basic and more cost-effective solutions.
Well, I'm so glad you're doing it. I've learned so much, and it's a great show. I can't emphasize or recommend it enough. If you're just joining us at United Facts of America, we're talking to Dr. Céline Gounder. She's the host of the Epidemic podcast. She's KFF Senior Fellow, a CBS News medical contributor, and wife of the late soccer journalist Grant Wahl, whose sudden death was exploited by anti-vaxxer conspiracy theorists. Your questions drive the conversation. Don't hold back. Ask anything on your mind. You can, if you're watching us right now on PolitiFact or Poynter.org, you can open the video on YouTube and leave your questions in the chat, and we will look forward to answering them. Dr. Gounder, your life took a devastating turn. It's almost a year ago when your husband, Grant Wahl, who we know is a great soccer journalist, collapsed while covering the World Cup. He had an aortic aneurysm. And very soon after, you found yourself and your family under attack from people who said you were to blame for advocating COVID-19 vaccines. There is and was no sign that vaccines had anything to do with his death. We were really sorry to learn of his death, but it was especially painful to see these claims. Can you talk about how you processed those accusations and how it's informed your work since?
Well, it didn't surprise me at all, frankly, that this happened. And in fact, basically right after I informed family of his passing, I felt like I had to kick into gear in getting him transported back to the US as quickly as possible, to have an autopsy as quickly as possible, to get information out about what was his true cause of death as quickly as possible, because I knew that there would be rumors and conspiracy theories about his death. This is simply the playbook. And disinformation profiteers are exactly that. They will look for anything that they can make money off of, that they can gain power off of, that they can gain social media followers from. And it is very much part of the playbook to take somebody who's a celebrity and use their story for their own personal aims, for their own personal gain. And we've seen this over and over again during the pandemic with COVID vaccines. Even Matthew Perry's death recently has been blamed on COVID vaccines. And I think, you know, aside from the people who are spreading these conspiracy theories, I think there are also a lot of people who are just desperate to have answers, answers that make sense to them, that are straightforward to understand. And sometimes that's just the easiest thing, is what is right in front of you. And I think, again, it's a question of lack of imagination, a lack of wanting to think bigger, further, also more slowly and thoughtfully about what might be going on.
You mentioned Matthew Perry. I mean, here at PolitiFact, anytime a celebrity dies, we feel like we can count the second until the claims start circulating. And it's almost like a subcategory of fact checking. We just know to look for the claims. I'm just, you know, as these narratives persist, what do you think are the most constructive ways to combat them? I'm not sure that, I'm just wondering. I feel like we do it a lot, but is there more?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most important thing is for people to understand what the playbook looks like. So number one, celebrity dies, you will start to hear these false claims. Just anticipate that. And so that tells you this is probably part of the playbook. I think some of the other typical things that you see are fake experts. So people who are not experts in the field that's relevant here. Maybe they're a doctor, but they're an orthopedic surgeon or a neuroradiologist or something that's not relevant in terms of expertise, claiming that the COVID vaccines or something else was the cause of death. Another typical approach is what we call logical fallacies. The most common one is probably A came before B, so therefore A must have caused B. So it's sort of that temporal association. But that would be like saying, well, I took the subway to work today, so therefore the subway must have killed me. You know, I understand that people, again, want to connect things, and that's maybe sometimes the straightest line, but that doesn't mean that something caused something else. And when you have the vast majority of the American population having gotten COVID vaccines, yes, there will be people who have strokes and heart attacks and cancer and who die suddenly who will have had the COVID vaccine. That does not mean that that those outcomes are related to the COVID vaccine. A couple other typical tactics. So another one is what we call impossible expectations. So the expectation that the vaccines would be perfect. We don't expect perfection of just about anything. We don't expect perfection from our electronics, our computers, our medication. It's not going to work perfectly. You're going to have to take your car in for servicing. That medication may not be enough on its own. You might need another to treat your high blood pressure, for example. So that's another tactic we commonly see. Another one is cherry picking data. So as scientists, we don't come to conclusions on the basis of a single study. We look at all of the studies in a particular space, looking at a question. We look at the methodology of each of those studies, and we put them together to try to figure out, okay, here is what probably is the best answer to this question based on the preponderance of the evidence. And cherry picking is when you take the one study that gives you the answer that you want to back up your claim. And so that's another very common one. And finally, just straight up conspiracy theories, which let's just call them what they are. They're lies. And so people telling lies to advance their own personal agenda.
in this case, you experience the personal harms of those. And I feel like there's a growing population of people who have had these kinds of experiences. I'm curious, do you have anything that you want to say to people?
Well, I think one challenge is that there's not good protections for people like me. My colleague, Dr. Peter Hotez, for example, has been harassed at his home. When you have people harassing you, stalking you, making death threats, there's not something like a legal fund to help support you. It's very difficult, having made some reports to the FBI personally, for them to intervene, to track some of these people down. So there really does need to be strengthening of protections for people who are targeted in this way.
We have a question from a reader. It says, can you touch on the role that social media influencers and celebrities play in health misinformation spread?
One of the things we've seen from both KFF polling, so I'm a senior fellow at KFF, as well as other polling, is social media influencers are not necessarily the most trusted people when it comes to medical information. Your own personal healthcare provider, whether that's a doctor, a nurse, a pharmacist, that person is still the most trusted. But social media influencers, celebrities do help magnify, amplify the spread of disinformation. And the more people hear that same disinformation over and over and over again, even if they don't trust that particular social influencer or celebrity, over time, that does start to lead them to believe that disinformation.
Along those lines, we're seeing reports that U.S. vaccination rates are down this year. Fewer people are getting flu shots and the latest COVID vaccines. KFF reported that childhood vaccine rates for measles, mumps, and rubella have dipped below 95%, and that's important because that's the level at which you can prevent community transmission. And we also saw a recent study from Annenberg Public Policy Center that found that Americans are losing confidence in vaccines overall. What's behind these lower participation rates and low confidence? And can you talk about, what risks they pose?
I think you have two things at work here. One is going back to what I was talking about, the playbook of anti-vaxxers and disinformation about vaccines, this idea of impossible expectations. And I think people have had ideas about vaccines, even before COVID, people would say to me, well, I'm not getting a flu shot because I got the flu anyway. And not really understanding that the purpose of vaccines, by and large, is to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. There are a couple vaccines where you can actually prevent transmission, but that requires certain biological characteristics, including a longer incubation period. So you do have that with infections like measles or smallpox. You do not have that with COVID and the flu, where your incubation period is quite short. So incubation period is a time from exposure to infection and getting sick. And so if you have a longer window, the vaccines actually can help prevent transmission. But if you have a much shorter window, shorter incubation period, they don't work very well for that. And so people have had these expectations that are frankly too high, that COVID vaccination, would prevent all infections, that flu shots would prevent you getting the flu. And the purpose of vaccines is really to prevent severe disease, hospitalization, and death. So that's number one. And remind me, Rebecca, the question again, reprompt me.
What's behind the lower participation rate?
Oh, right. So, the other issue is the politicization of vaccines. And I think what really drove that more than anything was that COVID emerged during a year where we had a presidential election in 2020. And so it was highly predictable that it was going to be politicized in that way, that the responses were going to be politicized, that there would be inadequate bipartisan collaboration, cooperation, giving of credit because of that. And it's not the only time we've seen this happen. I think another great example is Ebola in West Africa, where several of the countries in the region had their own presidential elections at the time. And we saw the exact same thing happen, the exact same language. For example, Ebola is a hoax. COVID is a hoax. We saw the exact same language used in two entirely different settings. What was in common is they were all dealing with presidential elections. And unfortunately, the US in particular is very politically polarized at this moment. And it's become part of people's identities. In fact, some pediatricians have reported to the American Academy of Pediatrics that they now have parents coming into the office where before they might have been hesitant and might have said something like, you know, are we sure these vaccines are safe? Are we sure they don't cause autism? Does my child really need to get so many so close together? Can we space them out apart? That used to be the concern. Now, parents are saying, you know, we just don't do vaccines. We're Republicans. And when something becomes so tightly bound with an identity, with this idea that if this is my identity, this is what I'm supposed to believe, you're not going to be able to change people's minds with facts. You're not going to be able to address that just by slowing the spread of disinformation or debunking disinformation. You're really going to have to go after culture and identity to address that.
If this continues, what kind of health risks? I mean, what is the reality of the risks that we face?
So in the past year or two, we've seen outbreaks, for example, of measles in Ohio. We saw cases of polio in upstate New York. These infections will come back, and they are not benign infections. Polio, for example, can leave people paralyzed, can also be deadly. Measles can also be deadly. People who get severe measles can develop severe pneumonias and die from that. They can also develop encephalitis, which is a brain infection, which can cause seizures and other neurological problems. So there's a reason scientists, doctors decided to develop vaccines against some of these infections, because they do cause very severe outcomes in some children.
You're a communicator, in addition to being a physician. I'm wondering, is there a communication strategy that can help with this, or what can we do? What needs to happen to change this trajectory?
Well, I think we need to be thinking about information as a supply chain. So, you know, very generically, you have raw data that gets processed, that then gets disseminated or distributed. And so instead of focusing all of our interventions at the tail end of that supply chain, so things like debunking or moderation, are there things we can be doing upstream in the information supply chain to address this problem? I think that's number one. Number two, you know, what I was just saying about identity and culture, I think we need some strategies that are not just about straight up news or scientific papers, publications, research, but that really do look at some of these cultural predisposing factors, or how certain ideas become part of someone's identity. How do you change that? I think that's another area we really need to be thinking and talking about more.
I want to go to COVID, some things that people have questions about during COVID. We were advised to take a number of public health measures that we know now were either not necessary or less effective than promised, like surface wiping or cloth masks. Can you talk about, I mean, will public health officials be more upfront about unknowns next time, or is it best practice when you're in that situation to take all precautions and risk the kind of resentment that we see now that might follow if those measures aren't effective?
Well, there was a certain paternalism, in particular related to masks, that concerned me early in the pandemic. Namely, that there was a reluctance to acknowledge that COVID was airborne. And we knew this by March, April of 2020, that this was clearly an airborne infection. And yet the language was still very much as if this was a strictly droplet spread 6 feet apart kind of infection. And that actually continues to persist until this day. And I would point your viewers to a recent 60 Minutes piece by my colleague, Dr. John LaPook, where he interviewed Lindsay Marr and others, Joe Allen, who are experts in infectious disease transmission through the air, where they were very well able to document that this was what was happening, that there were ways to mitigate, again, that don't go back to those biomedical tools. It's not always just about tests and treatments and vaccines. And it's not necessarily just about masks either, by the way. Things like indoor air ventilation, we should be thinking about the way we do about clean water and water treatment plants. Those might have seemed like very ambitious measures back in the early 1800s and late 1800s and early 1900s, but those are just standard today. And I think that kind of shift in thinking needs to happen. But going back to your question, there was this paternalism, this reluctance to acknowledge that even though there was clear evidence that COVID was airborne early in the pandemic, there was reluctance to say, yeah, you should wear a mask. And then when finally there were recommendations, it was to wear a cloth mask, which we now know better are really not very effective. Surgical masks are moderately more effective than a cloth mask. But what you really want is a KN95, a KF94, or better yet, an N95 mask to really protect you against infection. And I think the way to approach that in the future is to have what we need in the strategic national stockpile to be prepared for healthcare workers and what their needs are going to be, where you're not having to dissuade the public from using these tools because you're worried about supply and potential shortages. So I think that's one very good example of not having been fully transparent, having been somewhat paternalistic about the messaging. And I also think to this day that has not been clearly acknowledged by public health officials, by the public health community. And I think acknowledging those errors really would go a long way towards rebuilding trust.
Interesting. We have another viewer question that says, how would you like to see misinformation for profit combated? Are there practical ways to do it? And then there's a third question, it's long. This isn't a medical example, but for example, I get a lot of YouTube ads for money-making schemes. Is there some sort of screening process you would like them to go through before they're allowed to be served to people?
Well, that's, for advertisers, for there are companies that aggregate advertising and put it out there across different platforms. There are the platforms themselves. At all of those levels, I think there is a responsibility to be taking action to make sure that advertising is responsible. There are reputational reasons to do that, not necessarily regulations per se. And I do think part of this is also documenting what are the harms. And I think some of that is what are the public health harms? What is this costing taxpayers at a population level? And then also, what is this costing companies reputationally? If, for example, you're dealing with so many more hospitalizations in your community, so many more employees out sick, or so many more healthcare costs, what is that costing a company if they're part of the problem? And we just don't have firm numbers on those kinds of things. And so it feels very abstract, I think, to a lot of businesses, advertisers, and so on. And I think unless you put hard numbers on those, it's hard for them to really incorporate that into their decision-making.
Who would be who should be doing that? Who should be putting the hard numbers on that?
Well, people who do research on these things, whether that's economists, public health researchers, probably a combination of the two. And then you're talking about some role for academia, some role for government, which is one of the biggest, the biggest funder of research in this country, but also some of these corporate players and being enlightened in terms of their enlightened self-interest, trying to figure out what are some of the things where it could have the biggest impact on employee absenteeism, healthcare utilization, reputational impacts, and so on.
I have a really broad question now. We're about to have another presidential debate this week where we at PolitiFact feel like we're already in the thick of the 2024 presidential election. What influence do you see this election having on public health and vaccine misinformation?
Yeah, I think both public health and vaccines are going to be this political punching bag. I think it's going to be part of the partisan identity. And we've already seen it with certain politicians that they've really tried to stake out this space as how they differentiate themselves, whether that's RFK Jr. on the left or Ron DeSantis on the right. I think we are going to be hearing a lot more disinformation in the coming year about both vaccines and public health more broadly.
Where do you find hope in this landscape?
Well, one of my mentors is Dr. Bill Foege. He was one of the leaders of smallpox eradication. He was the director of the CDC under President Jimmy Carter and has gone on to work in a number of global health initiatives over the course of his career. And I go back to advice he has given me over time, and I probably remind myself of this almost every day, especially in this moment when sometimes it's hard to feel like with everything that's happening in the world, not just with COVID and public health, sometimes it just feels like there's only reason to despair. And what I remind myself is that the people who get things done are optimists. Bill's advice was surround yourself by optimists, people who are almost foolishly optimistic, who have unwarranted optimism, because those are the people who do get things done. And I think part of what gives me optimism is the fact that I and many of my friends and colleagues still have optimism that we can make a difference. Because if you don't, that's when you've already given up and it's really game over already.
I really appreciate your being here. We're going to leave it there. Thank you to Dr. Céline Gounder for the important work you do and your own commitment to sharing facts. I also want to thank everyone for tuning in to this important discussion and for sharing your questions. Just a reminder that United Facts of America continues at 1 o'clock Eastern with a discussion between PolitiFact Executive Director Aaron Schrockman and Peter Benzoni of the Alliance for Securing Democracy. They're going to explore how and why Russian propaganda is bypassing content bans and posing as local news. And please make sure you join us on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock Eastern as we at PolitiFact take you behind the scenes as we prep for the 8 p.m. GOP presidential debate. We will show you how we get ready for fact-checking the claims to come. And we will tell you more about our partnership with ABC News and 538. That's 7 p.m. Wednesday ahead of the 8 p.m. debate in Miami. Until then, I'm Rebecca Catalanello. Thank you so much.